Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
In the village of Guadalupe Hidalgo, just north of Mexico City, a diplomat who'd been fired 3 months earlier sat down to sign a treaty his president had explicitly ordered him not to negotiate. It was February 2nd, 1848, and Nicholas Trist was about to reshape the North American continent. The document he signed that day would transfer 525,000 square miles of Mexican territory to the United States, more than half of Mexico's entire nation. California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Land that would one day produce gold and oil, movies and microchips. But here's what troubles me about this moment. That treaty also made solemn promises to nearly 80,000 Mexican citizens who suddenly found themselves living in a foreign country. Promises about their land, promises about their rights, promises about their citizenship. And almost before the ink was dry, the United States began breaking them. This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. Picture this. It's late January 1848. American troops under General Winfield Scott occupy Mexico City. The Mexican government has fled north to the city of Querétaro, and Nicholas Trist, the State Department's chief clerk, is negotiating with Mexican commissioners in a church in Guadalupe Hidalgo, even though President James Polk recalled him from his mission 3 months earlier. Trist had received Polk's order in mid-November. The president was frustrated with the slow pace of negotiations and wanted to conduct talks in Washington instead. But by the time the recall order arrived, Trist sensed something the president couldn't see from 2,000 miles away. Mexico's unstable government was finally ready to negotiate. If he left now, that window would close. So Trist made a choice that would define his career and his country's future. He sat down and wrote a 65-page letter to Secretary of State James Buchanan, explaining why he was going to disobey a direct presidential order. If we condense that letter into 3 words, it would say, "Sorry, I'm staying." He knew it would end his diplomatic career. He knew Polk would be furious. But Trist believed the alternative was worse. Either a prolonged war that would cost more American and Mexican lives, or American extremists who wanted to annex all of Mexico getting their way. Let me take you back to understand how we got here. The war had started in April 1846, triggered by a border dispute that President Polk had deliberately provoked. Texas claimed its southern boundary was the Rio Grande. Mexico insisted it was the Nueces River, about 150 miles to the north. The strip of land between those rivers was effectively controlled by neither country, Comanche and Apache territory really. In January 1846, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to march his army from the Nueces River into that disputed zone, all the way to the Rio Grande. He positioned American troops on land that Mexico had every reason to consider its own territory. When Mexican cavalry attacked an American patrol on April 25th, Polk got exactly what he wanted. He told Congress that Mexico had shed American blood on American soil and demanded a declaration of war. Not everyone bought it. A young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln introduced what became known as the Spot Resolutions. demanding that Polk identify the exact spot where the blood had been shed, challenging whether it was actually American soil at all. And a young Army lieutenant named Ulysses Grant, who fought in that war from beginning to end, never forgave himself for participating. Decades later, after he'd commanded Union armies and served as president, Grant wrote in his memoirs, "I was bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day regard the war which resulted as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation." He went further, "I do not think there was ever a more wicked war. I thought so at the time when I was a youngster, only I had not moral courage enough to resign." The war itself was brutally one-sided. American forces captured Mexico City in September 1847, but winning the war proved easier than ending it. Mexico's government was too weak and fractured to negotiate, too proud to simply surrender. That's where Trist came in. Polk had sent him to Mexico in April 1847 with authority to negotiate a peace treaty. The terms were straightforward. Mexico would recognize American annexation of Texas, accept the Rio Grande as the border, and cede California and New Mexico. In exchange, the United States would pay Mexico $15 million and assume about $3 million in debts Mexico owed to American citizens. But negotiations dragged on. Santa Anna, who'd returned from exile to lead Mexico's defense, wouldn't grant major concessions. When Santa Anna was deposed in October, the new government fled to Querétaro and seemed paralyzed by indecision. Polk grew impatient and recalled Trist. What Polk didn't understand, what he couldn't understand from Washington, was that Mexico's new government had finally appointed peace commissioners. They were ready to negotiate the terms Polk wanted. If Trist left, that opportunity would evaporate. So Trist stayed. He negotiated in Spanish. He was fluent, sometimes acting as his own translator. The Mexican commissioners knew he'd been recalled, which Trist actually used to his advantage. He warned them that the next American negotiator might demand harsher terms, perhaps the annexation of even more Mexican territory. Better to deal with him now. On February 2nd, 1848, in the old Basilica of Guadalupe in the village of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Trist and the Mexican commissioners signed the treaty. When the document reached Washington, Polk was furious. Trist had defied his direct order. The president wanted to reject the treaty on principle. But when he actually read it, he faced a dilemma. Trist had secured everything Polk originally wanted. The war could finally end. Polk sent the treaty to the Senate, which ratified it on March 10th by a vote of 34 to 14. But the Senate made one crucial change. They deleted Article 10. Article 10 had guaranteed that the United States would honor all land grants previously made by the Spanish Crown and the Mexican government to citizens in the ceded territories. These weren't small plots. Families in New Mexico and California held community land grants covering thousands of acres. Grants that included not just individual homesteads, but communal grazing lands, water rights, and forest access. The Senate struck that protection out entirely. Articles 8 and 9 remained, promising that Mexican citizens in the ceded territories could become American citizens with full rights, and that their property would be protected. But without Article 10's specific guarantee of land grants, those promises proved hollow. What happened next is a story of systematic dispossession that continued for decades. When California entered the Union in 1850, Congress created a land commission to evaluate Mexican land grants. The burden of proof fell on the landowners. They had to prove their grants were legitimate under a legal system conducted in a language many didn't speak. using standards of documentation that Mexican and Spanish law had never required. The average case took 17 years to resolve. Even when Mexican families won, the legal fees often forced them to sell their land to pay their lawyers. By 1880, most Californios, the Mexican citizens who had become Americans, had lost their ancestral lands. In New Mexico, the process was even more devastating to community land grants. American law didn't recognize the concept of communal property the way Spanish and Mexican law did. Surveyors and courts broke up shared grazing lands, awarding them to individuals or declaring them public domain. Families who had ranched the same valleys for generations found themselves trespassing on what was now federal land. The pattern repeated across the Southwest. Promises made in 1848 evaporated through legal technicalities, language barriers, and a system designed for people who weren't there when it was designed. We're still living with the consequences. In 1967, nearly 120 years after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a preacher turned activist named Reyes Lopez Terrina led an armed raid on a courthouse in Tierra Amarilla, New Mexico. He wasn't trying to overthrow the government. He was trying to make a citizen's arrest of a district attorney over land grant disputes. Disputes that traced directly back to the broken promises of 1848. Today, in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, descendants of the original land-grant families continue fighting for recognition. Hispanic ranchers tell reporters their battle is with the U.S. Forest Service over access to lands their families used for centuries before anyone drew a boundary line on a map. Our identity is tied to place, one community historian explained. We don't see that place having an identity without us. It defines us just as much as we define it. At the University of New Mexico, researchers have documented how grants of 40,000 acres shrank to fewer than 1,400 through the confirmation process. The Government Accountability Office has studied these claims multiple times, most recently concluding that while the United States followed its own legal procedures, those procedures often failed to protect the rights the treaty promised. And what of Nicholas Trist, the diplomat who defied his president to make peace? When Trist returned to Washington, Polk fired him and refused to pay his salary for the months he spent negotiating the treaty. Trist's diplomatic career was finished. He spent the next 22 years working as a railroad clerk, struggling financially while the nation he'd expanded flourished. It wasn't until 1871, 23 years after he signed the treaty, that Congress finally paid Trist his back salary. President Grant appointed him postmaster of Alexandria, Virginia. He died 3 years later, largely forgotten. The philosopher George Santayana wrote that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But I think the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo teaches us something different. Sometimes we remember the past quite well, and we still repeat it. We just remember the parts that serve us. Americans remember the treaty as the moment we became a continental nation, stretching from sea to shining sea. We remember the gold discovered at Sutter's Mill just 9 days before the treaty was signed. We remember Manifest Destiny fulfilled. What we forget, what we're still forgetting, is that 80,000 people were promised they could keep their land, their rights, their way of life. And then we took it anyway, not through military conquest, but through legal systems that were never designed to keep those promises. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, consider this. Nicholas Trist risked everything to end a war he believed was unjust. Ulysses Grant fought in that war and regretted it for the rest of his life. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo achieved peace between two nations, but at what cost to the people caught in between? Because that's what this treaty teaches us, not just about 19th century expansion, but about ourselves, about the gap between the promises we make and the promises we keep, about how legal systems can become instruments of dispossession even while claiming to protect rights, about how the story we tell about our history shapes what we believe we owe to others. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this episode, then please subscribe. If you really enjoyed it, then please tell a friend. I hope you will join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.